listening to Heart of the Matter on Dundalk FM 97.7. This is Michael Amati to have our guest on today. Joining us is Doug Van Dorn. He's the pastor of Reformed Baptist Church of Northern Colorado. He's also the author of numerous books, including Waters of Creation, A Biblical Theology of Baptism, Galatians, A Supernatural Justification, Covenant Theology, a Reformed Baptist primer, and several other books. But we're actually not talking about any of those books today. We're talking about a book that he's written called Giants, the Sons of God. So Doug, thank you for joining us this evening.
Yeah, thanks for contacting me, Michael. Should be an exciting program.
Your book was really fascinating. I have to say, you're a very good writer, and I think I finished the book in 2 or 3 days, so I really enjoyed it.
That's a huge compliment, Doug. If Michael can't put down a book, it must be good.
Let's get to the book, though at hand, though. Before we get to the actual topic of it, one of the things that I think was extremely important that you pointed out, and you only spend a few paragraphs on, but you can kind of lay this out a little bit more, and it's one of the things that I've tried to do here at Dundalk Baptist Church. I actually did a 12, 13-week series on this, is the importance of reading the Bible as a story. And I think that is extremely important for the particular topic of this book of Giants that you've laid out. So can you kind of explain why it is that we need to read the Bible as a story?
Yeah, I love that question. I talk about it quite often because I think too many people go to the Bible really piecemeal and they don't see it being connected to other things that they find in the Bible. And, you know, even as I'm a Reformed Baptist, and a lot of times we come to the Bible just purely for theology, but the Bible really is telling a story, and it's telling a story of, you know, the Lord Jesus Christ. And I suppose there's lots of different ways that you can think about that story. And what I did in this book was I tried to look at his story from the context of Genesis 3:15, which a lot of people will call that verse kind of the first gospel in the scripture. It's this prophecy of the woman Eve having a seed, and then strangely the serpent in the garden having a seed, and they will have this war that will continue on through the pages of the scripture until one day there will be a final seed that will destroy the seed of the serpent. And what I kind of discovered as I was researching this book over the course of 2 or 3 years was that this seed idea of the serpent and of the woman too, I suppose, most people will take that figuratively and think about it in spiritual terms, like Jesus talks about the children of the devil being the Pharisees. Well, they're not biologically children of the devil, but they're spiritually that way because they're blind and in darkness, you know, hardness of the heart. But there's actually a way you can take it quite physically, and that is through this topic, this very strange topic of the giants.
Okay, so on that, let me just go ahead and get to the main verse that your argument kind of builds off of, and that's the text found in Genesis 6:4, which reads, "The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came into the daughters of man, and they bore children to them. These were the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown." So can you maybe explain what is your interpretation of this passage, and then maybe we can talk about the standard or maybe the most common interpretation that Christians have of it?
Sure. The oldest interpretation of this, and it's universal, when you go to Jewish literature up until about the 2nd century. So that includes we probably have 20 different sources that go before that, including prior to the New Testament. And then it's also universal as far as we know in the Church Fathers, is the only view that they held until about 250 AD, when a historian named Julius Africanus mentions that there's another view that he seems to maybe think is the right view. But we don't really get the Church Fathers talking about that for another 150 years. So really for the first 300 plus years of church history, this is the only view that you find as well. And that view is that these Nephilim, it's a Hebrew word, that a lot of people think comes from a verb meaning to fall, so they would be the fallen ones. But more recent scholarship has shown that it's actually related to an Aramaic word that means giants. And so the word literally does mean giants. And so the question is, why is he talking about giants, and how did they get here? So there's two groups of people that kind of spawn the giants. There's these daughters of men, and then there are these people called the sons of God. And since Augustine and Chrysostom, and about the turn of about 400 AD, I suppose, about when they were writing, they took the view that became the rabbinical view in the 2nd century, which is that the sons of God are, well, it's a little bit different than what the rabbis did, but basically they're just human beings. In the case of Augustine, they're Sethites. They're the sons of Adam and Eve's son Seth. And the daughters of men would then be the daughters of their son Cain. So they look at this passage as referring to kind of breeding between Christians and non-Christians, to put it in modern language. And but that's not the older view. The older view is that the sons of God refers to a group of it's kind of a title for heavenly beings, a specific group of heavenly beings. That phrase is used about 10 times in the Old Testament, and in every other occurrence, it refers to heavenly beings. The best place to go is 3 verses in Job. Job 1 and 2 both talk about Satan going into the heavenly court to meet with God, with the sons of God accompanying him. And then later in the book of Job, I think it's Job 38, verse 7, it talks about how the sons of God were there when God was creating man on the earth. And then it calls them the stars of heaven, and they were shouting for joy. So it's very clear that the sons of God is a title for heavenly beings. And so the view then would be that these heavenly beings, which are sometimes translated as angels, came down and did something with our women. And the result of that is this giant offspring, which are really kind of like demigods, like Hercules or something. So Zeus would be a son of God, but his children that are born from human women in Greek mythology would be demigods, and that's what the Nephilim would be, kind of parallel to that.
So in your book, you kind of separated out. I mean, you had 4 particular views on it, but they basically divided it into 2 categories: the supernatural and the natural view.
Right.
Why do you think that the naturalistic view has become so popular in Christianity? Have we adopted some part of the mentality of the Enlightenment that that just can't happen, even though we may claim supernatural events with the resurrection and raising the dead and other instances? That just is beyond us.
Yeah, I don't trace it to the Enlightenment, Michael. It goes way back, a lot farther than that. You can read in Augustine and Chrysostom themselves that they're just making fun of the supernatural view, and basically it's because they say, I can't believe it's true.
Yeah.
So they're incredulous about it, and that's 1,600 years ago. And
do you think we've just kind of picked that up? We haven't.
Sure, that's especially in Protestantism. I don't know what the Catholic view is, but the Protestants kind of took those 2 church fathers especially and ran with them as kind of their heroes of the early church. And so it was kind of just natural to adopt what they believed about this passage. Well, and there's also a bunch of missing literature that they didn't have at the Reformation that we've since discovered that's really shed a lot of light on the meaning of this. So in some ways you can't blame the older interpreters for something that they didn't have available to them.
Right. Well, we'll come back and we're going to talk more with Doug Van Dorn about his book, Giants, the Sons of God, right after our second song. Doug, one of the very fascinating things I thought that you wrote about in the book was the discussion in Genesis 1 of the repetitive phrase "after its kind" and how that tied into the Genesis 6 account. Can you kind of explain why this repetition of "after its kind"?
Well, you only find that phrase really in all the Bible, in Genesis 1 and then in the story of the flood. And then it's not found really anywhere else, but it's repeated in both of those texts several times. So it seems to be a pretty major thing. And the idea would be that God created his particular creations, whatever it is, whether it's animals or men in Genesis 1, and he made them specifically the way that he wanted them to be. So the reason for the flood comes along, and it says that he's going to save the animals after their kind, but he's going to destroy everything else. And you kind of start to wonder, what in the world does that mean? And you come to middle of Genesis 6, and you read about how there's this man named Noah who is blameless. And the word for blameless there isn't really talking about moral purity. It's actually talking about physical purity, like when they would bring a blameless sacrifice into the tabernacle or temple in order to have it be slaughtered for whatever they were sacrificing the animal for. It had to be physically pure. Same words being used for Noah. And then you read the after its kind, and then you start to understand what they were thinking with Genesis 6:4 and the Nephilim, and you realize that the Nephilim were not after the kind that God had created. It was would be a good word for them, and it's an abomination of what God had created.
So do you see, as you've looked back at these older sources, particularly of those who held this view that that the sons of God were these angels who have come down, that they went on then to describe Noah in that way? Was that a consistent interpretation as they continued on with the story?
I don't know that there's a lot of older fathers or even Jews that really, I mean, there's some of it, especially with the Jews. The fathers, not so much. I think it's because in the early days, like I said, this was the only view that there was, and so they didn't really feel like they needed to go around trying to prove it.
Right. Okay, so basically then the sons of God were angels who left their abode, came and had relationships with human women and produced these, what are called the Nephilim or the giants, as you've said. And then God is angry with what he sees on the earth. And I thought one of the helpful things you pointed out was it's not just that the sin of men, but it's all flesh that is responsible. And so all flesh dies. And so part of the reason for the flood then, at least to some degree, is the fact that you have this unholy union, if we can call it that, this offspring, unnatural offspring, that has been created because of the relationship between these angels and these women.
Right. And the all flesh thing it's a strange thing, because the Genesis 6 story doesn't say anything really more than the Nephilim. But you can start going into other passages and some of the prophets like Isaiah, and you come to some pretty strange texts about animals that seem to be half-breed animals. And they're viewed demonically. You don't really know if they're viewing them as if they were physically real or not. But there's no question that Isaiah is talking about. He talks about satyrs and centaurs and Lilith and all sorts of creatures that in mythology they're half-breed animals, and men is what they are. And so you just go, what in the world? Well, that's kind of a clue. And again, the Jews they took off on that and said that, all flesh on the earth had been corrupted. Right. So, I mean, it just makes you go, what in the world is going on? Yeah,
that's very true. I have to tell you, as I read your book, and like I said, I really enjoyed it and could have put it down. It was probably 11:30 at night, and I'm sitting there reading the book, and I'm thinking, okay, I shouldn't be reading this at nighttime because it's not the best bedtime reading.
Right. I tried not to write it at night.
So, as you're talking about giants, though, can you define for us what you classify as a giant? I mean, are we talking about somebody who's 20 feet tall, or what are we saying a giant is?
I think the best way to help people understand this, and especially if they're really struggling with what in the world, how in the world could anybody believe what I'm saying, right, is that any Bible-believing Christian knows that there are giants in the Bible, because one of the most famous stories in the Bible is about David and a giant. Mm-hmm. And you go to that story of Goliath, and you see there's variance in terms of the manuscripts that we have for how tall Goliath was, but he was anywhere from 6'8" or something to about 10 feet tall. And he could have been a little taller than that. And when you look into the stories of I do this in an appendix, I think, kind of the more credible stories of modern giants, and modern would be anything from New Testament times to the present day. You find that the credible stories are really anywhere from about 8 to 12 feet, and after that, it starts to get a little bit crazy. So we're not talking 50-foot, monsters. Right. we're talking about beings that are definitely beyond the average, what is normal for humans.
I think, Doug, there's a grave called the Long Woman's Grave near where we are here in Dundalk, and she was reputed to be anything from 8 to 9 feet tall. So,
yeah.
Is it necessary for these sorts of unholy relations, as you're talking about, to produce giants, or are the Nephilim a particular instance of this sort of giantism?
Well, I don't know about the second question. I've wrestled with that. I don't know how we could ever find the answer to that, frankly, because we don't know the DNA of a Nephilim.
Very true.
But the question, so obviously humans can grow to pretty tall heights. I mean, there's some 8-foot tall people living now, and I think Guinness Book of World Records with a fella in the mid 1900s, he was, something like almost 9 feet tall, and he had a pituitary gland problem and whatnot. It's possible that some of those giant stories that I think would be real, and it could be this particular grave that you have in Ireland that you're thinking of, could have been some kind of a problem like that, and they just didn't recognize it for any kind of like what we would, a medical condition, so they maybe worshiped this person or venerated them or whatever.
Well, what's interesting about this particular one is at the gravesite, the little tombstone by it says that her husband was 3 inches taller than her.
Yeah, that's what's so peculiar, right? That you can actually trace the migration of these people from the east to the west, and apparently they started somewhere around the Caspian Sea, and there was a couple different migrations. One went north of it, one went south of it. The people in the south ended up migrating into the land of Canaan, which of course is where the Bible story takes place. And then as they were kicked out by Joshua in the wars of Joshua, and that's kind of part of the storyline that we can talk about a little bit later if you want to, they migrated, where they could go. So they kind of went north into Galatia, and then they got kicked out of there, went farther north into France and Germany. Then they seem to have been kicked out of there, and they went, guess where? Right to where you guys are at.
Oh, right.
So there's actual historical reasons why there's so many giant stories in Britain and Ireland that I think are not pure mythology.
Right. So you think John McEwen was actually a real giant and not just a mythological person?
I mean, I think it's possible that these stories that you have over there, they're exaggerated, I'm sure.
Oh, yeah.
But being rooted in some kind of a historical truth, that kind of an idea doesn't bother me in the slightest.
Yeah. Yeah, just the fact that you have so many stories about giants throughout the world in so many different places. It's hard to discredit stories that... Yeah,
and it's not just, like you said, it's not just one giant. It's a whole group of them that are together, like a husband and wife that are buried together or whatever. Right. A whole clan or something like that.
Well, this has been very fascinating. We're going to have to take our ad break now, but when we come back, we'll be discussing more with Doug Van Dorn and his book, Giants, the Sons of God.
Well, we hope that you do get in touch with us on any of those ways. You can email the show on heartofthematter@dundalkfm.com, or you can catch us on Facebook, Heart of the Matter on Dundalk FM. And of course, we do bring greetings to all those who are listening, not just here in Ireland, but in the United States and on almost every continent. We haven't anybody on Antarctica yet, but that's the next one to come along. But hopefully you're enjoying the show, and if you're listening in India and in Africa, in Europe, and even in the UK and further south in Ireland as well.
Well, Kevin has a question he wants to ask you, but let's set it up a little bit by asking you. So when the flood happens, God has basically destroyed all flesh except for those in the ark. So after that time, the giants, these Nephilim, have obviously died. How do they come back then?
That's probably the number one question I get asked.
Is it the hardest question to answer?
I don't think so, actually. And I've become more convinced of the answer that I'll give you. First of all, you have to realize that they did come back because there were Nephilim in, Numbers chapter 13, at the very end of that story, where the spies go into the land of Canaan. They're actually called Nephilim. So we know that they're there. So then the question is, how do they get there? And there's been several different attempts to answer the question. Some of them are more funny than others. Like there's some Jewish traditions that there's a giant in the book of Numbers in Deuteronomy. His name is Og. And it says that he has like it's either a bed or it's a dolmen that is something like 12 feet long or something. And so they took these traditions of Og being very old and even at that time, and they said that he hitched a ride on Noah's Ark.
Holding on to the back of it as the flood's coming in.
Yeah. And Noah cut a hole in the top of the ark to let him get some food and stuff. But there's other ideas that maybe one of the lineages on the ark was tainted, and most people will point to somebody like Ham's wife, and that she carried the genetic material. That one doesn't seem to fly too well with me, just because God seems to be destroying all the flesh that is already tainted. So why would he put somebody on there that is tainted?
Right.
Then you've got the idea that maybe it wasn't a local flood, or it wasn't a worldwide flood. It was a local flood. So some Nephilim from other parts survived. That's, I suppose, a possibility. I don't really go with that one. I tend to think the flood was universal.
Yeah.
So the other idea, the one I think makes the most sense, is that there was another incursion of angelic rebellion that started to do the same thing after the flood. And perhaps they thought that because God promised he would never destroy the world with a flood again, that they were safe to do what they wanted to do. And the reason why I think this actually has a biblical possibility is in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, Paul makes a strange statement about women wearing head coverings because of the angels. And the only thing that seems to make sense, and there's actually scholars that have written on this, that he's alluding back to the Genesis 6 story and saying, watch out, you don't want to tempt them.
Yeah, I think you even either talked about that in their book, or maybe I was listening to another interview that you did, and you mentioned that there. But that probably makes the best sense of any of the interpretations I've heard of that, because you come to that and you're like, what does that mean? That angels? Why would that even be a consideration?
Exactly.
So
it doesn't seem to have any purpose other than if this was true.
Yeah, and it fits within the Genesis 6:4 context so well, I think.
Yeah.
Obviously, talking about this topic, you can't help but think of the recent movie Noah with Ridley Scott and Russell Crowe, and their interpretation of the Nephilim and that. What did you make of their interpretation?
So I have a good friend who's a Hollywood screenwriter. His name is Brian Godawa. He's actually a Reformed Christian who has written a novel series on this same topic. And he's got 7 books on the Nephilim called the Nephilim Chronicles. And he calls what Ridley Scott did there subversion. What the subversion is to take a worldview and to take kind of the story of the worldview, but to pervert it and to twist it into your own image. And that movie did that really well, so that it takes kind of a pagan worldview of earth worship and connects it to the biblical story, and then it disconnects Noah to the biblical God. And then, in terms of the Nephilim, I think what I remember is he had like these rock golems or something like that. They were kind of the comparison of the Nephilim. And that's actually coming from ancient Near Eastern Babylonian literature. And I can't remember. He'd have to remind me, but I don't think that the golems, they're real in their mythology, but I don't think that they're actually technically Nephilim counterparts.
Right. Okay.
So it's just he's retelling the story to pervert the truth, really, is what he's doing.
Yes. Mm-hmm. The other thing I wanted to ask you mentioned before the break, Doug, about, people and human reasons and explanations for giantism. One of the things, though, with disease and the whole idea of giantism is that people have a disability. They're not able to function well as in terms of physical capabilities. When we think of the Nephilim and think of other mythological giants, we think of physical prowess and being able to do extraordinary things.
Yeah.
So would that be another reason why you would lean towards a more supernatural understanding of their creation rather than a purely naturalistic one?
Yeah, the giants that we get in the ancient literature, like you said, it's not like a really tall, lanky person that is going to die at the age of 30 and has to walk on crutches by the time he hits 15 or something like that. These are seem to be well proportioned people that are able to fight. Actually, Julius Caesar, believe it or not, has a chronicles of his Roman wars when he goes up to Gaul, up to France. And he talks about these giant Gaul warriors that are just, he said the Romans couldn't beat them. They couldn't beat them back. And they tried for decades, couldn't beat them back. And he seems to be describing the same kind of things that are going on in the wars with Joshua. And if the migrations that I put in the appendix of the book are anywhere true, and that's actually right where they went to. So
Right.
Well, before we go to our next song, I want to ask you, at least as I was reading the book, there was probably only one sentence that I thought if somebody was just reading the book, one sentence stuck out to me as this would be a controversial statement. And it's on page 151. And you write, if the giants serve any purpose in the Bible, it is to die by God's omnipotent hand. So can you just maybe flesh that out a little bit? And what do you mean by if they serve any purpose in the Bible, it's to die?
So, okay, this goes back to the story of Genesis 3:15, and if these creatures if they are what I'm saying that they are, what the Father said that they are, what all the ancients said that they are, these are wicked beings. You can go to the book of Leviticus and you start reading about all of these things that the inhabitants of the land of Canaan did, and then it usually mentions in a list a group of clans that are in one way or another, either directly or through marriage, related to these giant clans. So these are not holy people in the Bible. They're wicked beings.
Mm-hmm.
Their parents are from just horrible. Imagine it, heavenly rebellion of angels lusting after our women, and then relating that back to the serpent in the Garden of Eden. The Bible's not portraying these as beings that should be kept alive. And one of the big questions people have about the Old Testament God is why would he command the utter destruction of all these people in Canaan?
Mm-hmm.
And what's interesting is that he doesn't do that for many of the nations that Israel comes in contact with, like the Moabites or the Edomites. He basically tells them not to touch them. But when you come to these people, you need to destroy them, because these, not only are they wicked, but this is the battle of the Old Testament between the seeds. It's the battle of basically good versus evil. And so it seems that God keeps them alive just so that he can show that he is omnipotent over the greatest giants, that the world has ever seen. And there's even word plays that go on in Joshua where the mighty men of Israel, that's taking the language of the Gibborim from Genesis 6:4. I think that's in in Genesis 6:4. They're these mighty men of old. He uses that for the little tiny Jewish fighters who are killing the true Gibborim. So it's an ironic thing that's happening there, and God's he's exterminating them.
Well, we're going to go to our next song right now, which is I Surrender All by Ascend to the Hill, and we will be right back after this to talk more with Doug Van Dorn. So, Doug, I know you have an appendix just on this very question, but I'm going to ask you anyway. Throughout the book, you're drawing from several non-canonical texts, first Enoch, Pseudo-Jonathan, but you also draw from stories from different cultures and primarily from the ancient Greeks. So, like I said, you have this whole appendix on this issue, but can you just maybe lay out how is it that we should understand, in light of what you've said, the relationship between these mythological stories that we find in ancient Greece and ancient Rome and throughout cultures throughout the world, and then what the Bible says as well? How do we relate these two? Because at the end of the book, you come away realizing that there is some truth behind all of these myths, and that we can't just push it aside as this is just polytheistic nonsense, but it's actually drawing from truth. So how do we make this relationship, or what is the relationship?
Oh boy, we could talk about that one for a long time. That's a great question, Michael. A really important question. I think the way I like to start talking with people about it is that maybe we have a kind of a wrong view of the Bible in relation to other old books. So that sometimes we think that the Bible is the only book that's telling the truth about anything. That's not what the Bible is for, and that's not what we mean when we talk about it being inspired. It's inspired because it tells us the way to salvation and what God requires in terms of obedience to Him and what He has done to bring salvation to men. And it's perfectly infallible in what it's telling us to do there. But it also touches on history. And history is objective, and it's outside of Israel, and other people are telling history, and they're seeing the same things. And so we should kind of expect that if it's real, that other people are going to be talking about it as well.
Mm-hmm.
So you come to some of these other books, and it kind of scares people off because, well, why in the world would I want to read First Enoch? That's got to be an evil book. Well, no. It's just a Jewish book written by perhaps even a believing Jew before the time of Christ. Mm-hmm. And, it's telling the very same story that Jude and Second Peter are telling about this particular topic. And in fact, Jude is actually, he alludes to or quotes the book of First Enoch at least a dozen times. And it's not like Jude is a gigantic long tome. I mean, it's like just less than 30 verses long. So he has Enoch all over his mind and is actually quoting from the very parts of Enoch that talk about the giant story. So we shouldn't look at that literature and just slough it off as it's all a bunch of lies.
Mm-hmm.
You want to be careful with what it says, but the Bible would be our final authority. But basically, the Bible is writing the same story that everybody else is writing.
So there is. When you're reading these Greek mythologies about Hermes, for example, there's somewhere back behind that story is an element of truth in there. It's just over time it's become distorted and expanded and blown out of proportion, or various things have happened to it. But there is some truth that is behind where it came from.
Yeah, a good way to help people see this as well is when it comes to the flood, for whatever reason, most Christians that support like a worldwide flood idea, they have no problem whatsoever going to the 400 different cultures of the world mm-hmm. that all talk about a flood and saying, look, they talked about a flood. Look, they talked about a flood. And using that to say, see, that it's not ridiculous to say the Bible's talking about a flood. Every ancient people had a flood myth. Same thing's going on with the stories of the giants. I have an interesting series of books. I can't remember what the guy's name is. I think his last name is Johnson. He looks at the Parthenon and he kind of decodes the Parthenon. I have no idea if he's right or not, but what's interesting about it is what he says, his take on the Parthenon, which is it's four-sided building that's got basically their mythology put into pictures around the whole mm-hmm. thing. And he says he thinks that what they're doing is telling the biblical story, but making the biblical bad guys into the good guys, and the biblical good guys and the bad guys.
That's interesting.
Yeah, it really is.
Huh.
Doug, in terms of the overall story of the Christian message and, the message of redemption in terms of God sending His only begotten Son into the world to save sinners, how do you see this story fitting into that narrative?
That's really the main question that I kind of wanted to leave the reader with in the book. So many books that are on giants that are out there that you can read, they just go off really the way they want to leave you is kind of in tension of Jesus' second coming and how the Nephilim are coming back and all this kind of stuff. And I wanted to go a very different take with it and kind of leave people with Jesus' first coming. So the Old Testament can be read as a story of the Nephilim and their offspring fighting wars against Israel and God eventually defeating them, but Israel falling short of what they were supposed to do. And the book of Judges is kind of all about that. They refuse to kick him out of this place. They refuse to kick him out of that place. They refuse to kick him out of that place. So judgment comes upon Israel. Jesus is born into this era of just judgment. The people have been returned to their land, but they're without prophet, priest, and king. And when you get to the New Testament, you see this strange language. It's really not repeated anywhere else except in the Gospels, a little bit in Acts and stuff, but of this demonic activity. So where this gets really strange is that, again, this is kind of a universal view of the origin of demons, and you actually find a counterpart to it in Greek thinking. Augustine talks about this in his City of God, that demons they were thought to be creatures of the air. Think of like Ephesians 2:1, the prince of the power of the air. And the reason why is because they were children of heavenly fathers and earthly mothers, and they didn't have souls that went either up or down. They just kind of stayed around. So actually a demon in the minds of these guys was, a lot of people think a demon is a fallen angel. That would not be what they would say. They would say that a demon would be the offspring of the fallen angels and human women. In other words, it's a disembodied Nephilim. So Jesus coming into that kind of a context starts to make a lot of sense of this continuing story that doesn't end in the Old Testament. Jesus is defeating the demons with just a word. He has no problem doing it. Mm-hmm. And he's showing his power over them. And then the cross comes along, he dies, and Paul talks about how if the rulers of this age had known what they were doing, and he's not just talking about Herod and Pontius Pilate, he's talking about the principalities that are behind them, the heavenly beings, and that would also include demonic beings. And you can even think about C.S. Lewis, right, when he has Aslan dying, and all of the half-breed animals are around that death.
Yeah,
Lewis knows what's going on when he writes that. I mean, he's writing about this very thing. The demons are hoarding around Jesus. The bulls of Bashan, David would call them in Psalm 22. And so Paul says if they would have known what they were doing, they never would have crucified the Lord of glory, because it meant their destruction. They had no idea. They thought they were winning, and it's through his death that he ends up defeating them.
I don't know if this is along those lines or not, but I'm going to jump from this book to, I'm assuming what you cover in your book on Galatians. Does the stoicheia, does that relate to this in any way, or what do you say that is? Because usually it's translated something like the elemental powers of the world or something like that.
Yeah, elemental powers. That's a really strange place. It's in Galatians 4. They're called stoicheia, and the Greeks had different ideas of what the stoicheia were. In our modern anti-supernatural, naturalistic, materialistic context, we just tend to think, well, maybe it's just kind of laws of nature or something like that. Mm-hmm. But I think there's no question that Paul's talking about some kind of a heavenly spiritual entity. What's really strange about that is after he talks about that, he talks about himself as having been considered by the Galatians. Oh, and by the way, I think I mentioned this earlier, the Giants, all the legends are that they went into Galatia. Okay. So, they would have had this context as he's writing about this. He says that, I was so sick that I couldn't be healed. I couldn't heal myself. Well, this is such a strange thing to say. Why would he say that? Well, you go to Acts, when he goes into one of the towns in Galatia, it says they thought that he was Hermes. Yeah, and they thought that Apollos, was Apollos who was with him, or Barnabas? Maybe Barnabas. They thought he was Zeus.
Yeah.
And well, Hermes turns out to be the god of healing and of messages, sending messages and stuff. So Paul's basically saying God wouldn't even let me be healed of this in order just so that you guys realize I'm just a man like you are. So, I mean, the whole thing is just loaded with this supernatural language that is just really fascinating to think through.
Well, we have been talking with Doug Van Dorn, pastor of Reformed Baptist Church of Northern Colorado and the author of several books, including the one we've been discussing today, Giants, the Sons of God. Thank you so much for joining us. It's been a pleasure talking to you, and I just want to say again that I really enjoyed the book, and I don't have the books, but they are on my to-read list, The Waters of Creation and the Galatians book that you've written. So hopefully after I get those read, if you have the time, come back and we can talk about those ones as well.
I'd love to.
Have we come to the end of the show then, Michael?
We have. It's always goes very quickly. So thank you all for joining us, and it just remains for us to say thank you and good night.
Thank you and good night. And we close with a song called Forever Rain by Hillsong.
Good when there's nothing good in me. You are love on display for all to see. You are light when the darkness closes in. You are hope, you have covered all my sin. You are peace when my fear is crippling. You are true, even in my wandering. You are joy